All right, so we're in a series. You can see it on the screens called Action, and we're going through the book of James. And the entire theme behind the book of James is putting feet to our faith. So I go in that direction this morning because that's the direction of our text this morning, because this whole book is written to a group of Christians, Jewish Christians, who were living in non-Christian cities and were being instructed on what faith really looks like. So when we journey through this series, can I encourage and maybe challenge some of us to lean in to what God's word says, because it will change you from the inside out if you look and do what it says. And so this week, we're in James 2 because we're going right through it. And again, for context, you've got James. He's the brother of Jesus. He wrote this book to a group of Christians who are kind of spread out in different non-Christian cities. So the people of God, the Jewish people, Jesus came and they start to believe in him because he died, was raised to life, and left them with instructions as his church to follow him and help others follow him. The churchy way of saying that would be to make disciples who make disciples. So James is writing a letter to this group of Christians in non-Christian cities, and he's talking to them about what faith really looks like and how to apply feet to your faith and how to live it out. And so I'm going to give you the big idea for this week's conversation. A faith is not a faith unless it's lived out. See, faith is action-oriented. And we're going to learn that today, and I want to prove it with kind of an experiment, because some of us are going to hear a conversation like this today, and we're going to doubt the strength of our faith. And we're going to say, oh, okay, Scott, I hear what you're saying. I want to have real faith in my life, but I don't know that I'm built to have real faith. Faith that has feet to it. And maybe you kind of doubt that sometimes. I want to encourage everyone with a real-time experiment to prove to everyone that every single person within earshot of my voice is a person of real faith. You ready for it? You all sat in that chair, proving that you have faith in that chair, that it will keep you up. Your belief that chair would hold you up translated into a behavior to where you walked right in and sat on it. And now some of you, for the rest of the time I'm up here talking, are just going to be thinking, I really hope it does hold up. It's held up every other Sunday, right? But everybody has the capacity for real faith. Everyone does. But that faith that we have in Jesus, I'm going to ask you a question to open, and I'm going to ask the same question to close. Does your faith show up in your life? Because that's what James is going to say here. So if you would, go with me. Turn there in your phone, in your Bible. We'll follow along on the screen. In James chapter 2, in verse 14, and we got a lot of verses to go through. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is a teaching-heavy week. This is a teaching-heavy conversation. We're going to learn some things, and we're going to receive some things, hopefully. And then my prayer is that we quite literally lace up our shoes and take it with us, because that's what James is going to teach here as he writes to this group of Christians in non-Christian cities. Man, do you ever feel like maybe that's kind of sometimes your story as a Christian in American culture or world culture? Maybe you look out and you say, man, it doesn't seem like people value the truth of God. And it seems like this just gets harder and harder to hold on to these values that God instills in us. Anybody ever kind of feel like that because you live in California maybe, and sometimes you feel like you stick out like a sore thumb as a Christian sometimes? Almost like you got something in common with the people who were receiving this letter. So lean in a little bit, because we're not to curse it, we're to redeem it. We're to be a light in it. So this is what James says. In verse 14 of chapter 2, what good is it, dear brothers and sisters? You need to understand something here. I think what I've learned in New Testament scripture, anytime any one of the writers says, dear brothers and sisters, that's a loving way of saying, I'm about to say something really harsh to you, but I love you. You ever had one of those? You ever had those conversations, maybe with your spouse or your kids? Hey, I love you, but I need to say this to you. And you're like, oh, where's it coming? But it's in love, and he's doing this in love because it's going to sound like a pretty harsh challenge. But listen, he's saying, look, I'm with you. You know what he's saying there? Dear brothers and sisters, us. Us. He's not saying you. This is not a finger-pointing letter. This is not a finger-pointing conversation. This is a we are following Jesus together, and we're all in the same family. He says, if you say you have faith but don't show it by your actions, can that kind of faith save anyone? Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say, goodbye, have a nice day, stay warm, eat good. But then you don't give that person any food or any clothing. What good does that do? You see, faith by itself isn't enough unless it produces good deeds. That word deeds is Greek for, you can see it on the screen, action. It's the title of our series. Unless that faith produces good deeds, it is dead and, what's that word? Useless. Now, I want to be clear on something that James doesn't say, because he uses a phrase here, can that kind of faith save anyone? We'll hear that, saving faith. We are saved by grace through what? Faith. We'll hear that a lot. Let me unpack something real quick that James doesn't say so that no one gets confused. Nowhere in here does James say that your good deeds, your good works, your actions lead to salvation. Nowhere does he say that. He's not saying that your works are what save you. He's saying it is this faith in who? Jesus. That's who does the saving. It is not what you do that earns salvation. What he's saying is that your works, your actions, are a response to salvation. They're a response to what God did. I would say it like this, that your works are not a path to salvation. That your works, your good deeds, are proof of salvation. So to be very clear, grace is opposed to earning, but it's not opposed to effort. See, there is nothing you could do to earn God's love. There is nothing you could do to earn your way to God. None of us are perfect. So then, if we are not the ones who do the saving, our works will never lead to salvation. But the salvation that we choose to receive through Jesus and his sacrifice as his defining love was given to humanity, our lives are to be a response to that saving grace of God. You believe it and you receive it, but that reception is active, isn't it? If you were to be drowning and kind of the heavenly Coast Guard approaches in its helicopter, and it's Jesus, and he's alone in the helicopter, and he lowers down a raft, and you're sitting there and you're drowning in the ocean, and he lowers down the raft, and you look up and you say, yes, Jesus, I believe that you can save me with this life-saving device, but just in case anything else can, let me just kind of tread water here for a minute and see if anything else would maybe come along and save me. Is that saving faith? No. You got to do what to be saved? You got to reach out and grab that raft. That's the kind of saving faith that he's talking about here, is a faith that is action-oriented. It is a faith that is a response, that Jesus doesn't show up with that life raft because you've been doing great. So you finally earned your way of salvation. Do you know that the word saved in the Greek means to rescue from peril? In fact, think about it. If you could save yourself by the works that you do, there would be no need for saving. There'd be no need for rescue. So I want to be very clear. You are not saved by good works. You are saved for good works. By grace, through faith in Jesus alone. But faith in Jesus is never alone. It always comes with a response. Faith in Jesus always comes with feet. And he uses a tangible example. Say one of us runs into the other one of us, and we need food, and we need clothing, and you look at him and you're like, hey, looking great. I bet you're well fed. Have a great one. Did you help them? No. Because words without works are just noise. It's just noise. And he actually says that. He says, now some may argue in verse 18, some people have faith and others have good deeds. He's saying, look, some people are going to say, hey, there's people with faith, and then there's some of us who do things. He says, but I say to you, how can you show me your faith if you don't have good deeds? He's asking the question, okay, if you say you have faith, how would I ever know? How would I know? Yeah, I remember years ago I was preaching somewhere and I'd mentioned my brother in a conversation. And my entire team, who had spent years serving with me, had never heard me talk about my brother. And they approached me after service and said, did you just completely make up a story that you had a brother just for a sermon illustration? Almost like pastors will do that sometimes. And I looked at him and I said, no, his name is Justin. He lives in New Jersey. He's my brother. And they said, you do not have, you know what they said? We've never seen proof of your brother. And I had to pull out my phone and show them an actual photo of my brother. You know why? Because if it doesn't show up, how's anybody going to know? I'm a Christian. Would anybody ever know it? He says, so if you show me your faith without good deeds, how am I ever going to know that you have faith? He says, no, I'll show you my faith by my good deeds. He says, when you look at my life, I want you to see Jesus. When you look at my life, I want you to see that I have faith in Jesus. And he goes in pretty hard here because he's going to explain the type of faith that he wants them to have, and it's the type of faith that God wants us to have. Because you're going to find that James offers that there are different kinds of faith. And some of us, it's going to hit us in a way, and we're going to have to apply this. And this is what he says in verse 19. He says, you say you have faith, for you believe there is one God. Good for you. Even the demons believe this, and they tremble in terror. How foolish. Can't you see that faith without good deeds, faith without action, faith without feet is useless? Do you read what he says there? Because that's pretty in your face. He says, okay, great, I'll hear you. You have faith. Good for you. You believe there's one God. Good for you. But you know, even the demons believe, and they tremble in terror. Has anybody ever kind of brought you to the level of a demon? Yeah, I don't know. Depends on the dynamic in your marriage, what you've been called over the years. But maybe you've ever kind of, I see some people looking around at each other. Somebody got one of those. You know what he's saying here? He's describing three different kinds of faith. And because I'm a preacher, they're going to alliterate. So hang in there. This is what he's describing. He's describing three kinds of faith. He's describing dead faith, demonic faith, and then what he's wanting us to have, dynamic faith. You know what he says here in James 2 in the words that he's using? He says, listen, dead faith appeals to the intellect. Demonic faith appeals to the intellect and the emotions. But dynamic faith appeals to the will. Dynamic faith has feet. I would put it this way. Dead faith looks at facts. Yeah, I believe that. Demonic faith looks at fear. They believed and even trembled. But dynamic faith, that has feet. That is the type of faith James says, I want you to put feet to your faith, because saying you believe something and never showing it is an empty expression. And empty expressions are expressions without demonstrations, because words without works are just noise. A faith isn't a real faith unless it is lived out. That's the type of faith James, the brother of Jesus, says Have this kind of faith. And we're about to go really somewhere neat. And I'm going to use a word that's going to make some people uncomfortable in church. So good for us. But to be fair, at least I'm not up here wearing shorts and flip-flops making people more uncomfortable. So as the story I'm about to tell, oh my goodness, if this is your first time here, you have no idea what I'm talking about, but everybody else did. You have to watch online last week to catch that. He's going to use examples here to drill in further what he's talking about, because remember, these are Jewish Christians in non-Jewish cities. They knew the history of their people. And look at what he says. He goes, man, how can you have faith without good deeds? That's useless faith. He goes, okay, let's go there. He says, do you remember that our ancestor Abraham was shown to be right with God by his actions when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? Abraham, for just concise terms that everybody could understand, was essentially the father of the Jewish nation. Maybe you grew up in Sunday school and you sang that song, Father Abraham had many sons. Okay, that's enough of that. You don't want to hear that. But he hides it because Abraham's on the Mount Rushmore of Judaism. And so he's saying, you remember? So he's just going right there. He's like, I'm going to the original, like, here's one everybody's going to know. Do you remember that he was shown to be right with God? You see, his faith and his actions, what does he say? Worked together. Faith and actions are not mutually exclusive. Dynamic faith appeals to the will. He says Abraham's faith and actions worked together. His actions made his faith complete. And so it happened, just as the scriptures say. Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. He was even called a friend of God. So you see, we are shown to be right with God by what we do, not by faith alone. See, God makes us right with him, but if people want to know that you follow Jesus, you have to live it out. Do you know when it says Abraham, it was counted him righteous? That's a financial term in Hebrew. That was a financial term. He likens it in the Greek language here. And it means it was deposited into his account. It was reckoned. It was balanced. It was contributed to his account. What it meant was there was proof that Abraham believed in God, so that righteousness was shown. You could take that to the bank. It was provable. It was able to be calculated and drawn from, meaning it was real proof that Abraham believed. He uses the father of the Jewish nation to say, look, even this man, he believed God. How do we know he believed God? Because he did what God said. His actions and his faith work together. And this is the one that's going to make some of us uncomfortable. Then in verse 25, Rahab, the prostitute, is another example. She was shown to be right with God. You'll think, wait, hold on. You just said prostitute and shown to be right with God in the same two sentences. By her actions when she hid those messengers and sent them safely away by a different road. He uses two polar opposite examples here to highlight something. And I'm going to say this because this isn't actually a part of the conversation, but I want you to hear this. James uses Abraham and Rahab, the father of the Jewish nation and a prostitute. In this woman's story, it was what you would call maybe an early Israeli forces special operations recon team that ran up on her and she helped them and protected them. And that's kind of her story in a nutshell. And James uses both Abraham, father of Jewish nation, Rahab, prostitute, to highlight something really unique about faith that I think we need to get a hold of, because sometimes we think maybe we are too far away or others are too far from God to have faith. You know what he's saying here? Faith is not an exclusive club you earn your way into. Because one of the men on the Mount Rushmore of the Jewish traditional faith and a prostitute are used in back-to-back examples of showing their faith with their lives. You don't have to show some ID or pay off a bouncer to get into the faith club. Nobody's running your bank statements like you're trying to buy a timeshare to see if you can actually afford this timeshare. So we spend the 90 minutes with you trying to sell you this timeshare because we think you might actually afford it. Instead, we're going to run your bank statements to see that you earn the type of income that will make it worthwhile for us to spend 90 minutes for you to sell you this thing just so you can have faith. Nobody's doing that. God's not looking at your spiritual bank statement saying, are you worthy of faith in me? That's not what he's doing, because James says, look, the father of the Jewish nation and a hooker. That made somebody uncomfortable. Deal with it. They had faith. They had faith. You know why? Faith is available for anyone who would believe it and receive it. You know that word that Jesus uses in John 3:16, it's the most famous verse in the Bible. That whoever what? Believes in him. You know the word Jesus uses, belief, there is actually the word for faith. You know they have the same root word. His brother uses the word faith right here. The word Jesus uses in John, it's the same root word. You know what it means? A belief you cling to. A belief that shows up. Faith is not a burden, it's a blessing. And it's something that God gives us to know that our lives are made for greater, that our life gets to be about something bigger than ourselves, that hope is real, it's tangible, we can have it. And hope, somebody hear this, hope does not hinge on our ability to produce it because of our capacity to earn God's love and grace. Hope hinges on the work of Jesus, who made a way when no single person in the history of the world could ever earn up to the love of God. But because he is so loving and merciful and gracious and generous, he sent Jesus to make a way. And the faith God calls us to is a faith that looks at the rescue and says, I need that rescue, and I will receive that rescue, and my life will be a response to it. That's the dynamic faith that James is talking about. And I think two things happen when we choose that faith. I think the first thing that happens when we choose dynamic faith is we experience God's best because we surrender to God's way. Unless your faith has feet, you're going to be navigating life on your own. And how many of us have experienced when we do things our own way, we tend to just get in our own way. So when you choose to have dynamic faith, put feet to your faith, you experience God's best because you surrender to God's way. And you know what else happens? Other people see your faith lived out, and it blesses them. So this blessing of faith that we choose to receive in Jesus is also a blessing to others when we live it out. Because Abraham was the father of the Jewish nation, and they followed his example of faith. Rahab played a role in to help the people of God move in God's direction because she chose in faith to act on it. But here's the question we have to ask. And I opened with it, and I'll close with it. Does your faith show up in your life? How do we get tangible with this? If we're actually going to say the desire is to put feet to our faith, how do we do that? Does your faith show up in your marriage? When you have conversations, do you approach conversations with humility, with grace? Or do you approach them with accusations and impatience? Do you see your spouse the way God sees your spouse, as precious as his? Or do you see your spouse as someone whose sole existence is to alter and manipulate your happiness by the things they do to serve you? Or do you see your spouse as someone to be served and loved? As someone to go along with you in this journey with Jesus? Someone to challenge you and encourage you and serve with you? Does your faith show up in your marriage? Does your faith show up in your parenting, in your grandparenting? Because we're told that children are a blessing. Does your faith show up when your kids drive you crazy and your patience has hit the end of its line and you don't feel like you have any more to give? Does your faith show up there? Does your faith show up when your kid disagrees with you and they're at a teenage age where when they start to disagree with you, they can put some thoughts together and it makes you think, do I know what I'm talking about? They seem smarter than me right now. I've helped them with their homework. Maybe they are smarter than me sometimes. But you know that God is directing you to guide them with wisdom, but sometimes the wisdom to guide your teenager is to listen first and speak second. Are you slow to speak with your kids? Are you slow to anger? Are you quick to listen with your grandkids and your children? Does your faith show up in your parenting? Does your faith show up in your other relationship, in your workplaces, in the marketplace, when you're out there? Do people at work know you follow Jesus because maybe they get together and they gripe and they complain all the time and they talk about things that are inappropriate, and do they know, oh, well, so-and-so, yeah, they never get involved in those conversations. Something's weird with them. Does your work ethic show that you follow Jesus? When everybody else is kind of slacking off and they're willing to kind of cut corners and be dishonest about the way they spend their time, do you do things with integrity? Does your faith show up when everybody just thinks about themselves at work? Are you a thoughtful person? Do you know that the Harvard Business Review put out a thing years ago that it said the most highest performing employees of any organization were also the most thoughtful and generous employees of those organizations? That's not a Christian company. That's the Harvard Business Review that put that out through Forbes magazine, that the thing that stood out the most was directly related to faith in God, characteristics of God, generosity and service. Does your faith show up? Because here's one we just assume. Let's not. Does your faith show up in church? Does your faith actually show up in church? It's time to sing. Great, let's just repeat these words. No. Don't sing at the air. Don't sing at the back of the head in front of you. Are you actually singing songs to your Savior? Are you actually lifting up praise to the God who hung the moon and stars and chose to give you breath and life and hope? Does your faith show up in church when other people want to complain about things, or they maybe want to get involved in gossip? Because I don't know if you know this or not, but church is full of people, and everybody is an imperfect person. So sometimes imperfect people interact with other imperfect people, and stuff happens that doesn't honor God. Whoa, shocking, I know. But does your faith show up in those moments where you lean into spiritual maturity to say, okay, I don't understand or I don't agree, but I want to have conversations and I want to trust that God is in control. And instead of talking about someone, I'll go talk with someone. And when I approach that someone, I don't approach them with arrows, I approach them with ears. Does your faith show up in church? God, I believe that everything is yours. Just nothing that touches my wallet. Just nothing that touches my bank account. God, I believe that you are good, but you're not good enough for this check. Oh. God, I believe that you have rescued me and made me for greater, but that greater does not involve me waking up an hour early to come serve at church. Sorry, God, that greater is not as nice as my pillow. Does your faith show up? Here's what I think happens. James says, look, there's a faith that appeals to the mind, there's a faith that appeals to the feelings, and then there's a faith that is lived. And that's dynamic faith. That word in the Greek is a confidence, belief you cling to. So ask yourself the question, does my faith have feet? Because I think a lot of us, to give ourselves credit, we have faith. But maybe it's not showing up in some areas. And here's what I mean by that. And this is why I've got my trusty toy. Now, I borrowed this from our kids' ministry without permission, so don't tell them. I like this toy. Did you ever study science in school and learn the difference between potential energy and kinetic energy? See, potential energy is when something is ready to rock and roll, but it's not moving. It's got energy, but you can't see it. Kinetic energy that's when you see it. I think a lot of us sometimes, we're sitting back here and we got our potential energy. We got our potential faith. Yeah, God, I believe you. I believe you. It's hard. It's just hard to live it out right now. It's hard to be gracious with that person. It's hard to forgive that person. It's hard to be generous with my time, with my talent, with my treasure. It's hard to listen first. It's hard not to argue. It's hard to consider others. It's hard to lean into growth in you so that I don't just constantly contribute to things that I know I shouldn't. God, I have faith in you, but what I look at on the internet is my business, God. And I have faith in you, but when I disagree with somebody on the internet, that faith probably isn't going to show up in the comments section. So a lot of us, we got potential faith right there. You know what James says? No. Have dynamic faith. So ask yourself this question. Does my faith show up in my life? Does your faith have feet? Because when it does, we experience God's best because we submit to God's way. And the blessing of faith that we are given when we choose it will bless others. Would you pray with me? And we'll continue to sing together as we pour out our faith in worship. God, thank you again for today. I pray that you're honored by it. We said the same thing to start. We're going to say the same thing to close. God, that it is a gift from you. Be honored in everything that is said and done in this place, that this would be helpful, that we would lace up our shoes and put feet to our faith. And maybe for some of us, we're asking that question as we leave here today. Okay, God, this is all for you, so help me put feet to my faith in all of these areas this week. God, maybe even for somebody in the room, we're asking the question, God, I don't know that I have actual faith in your son, Jesus. I think I've just kind of checked a box and maybe just accepted that, yeah, sure, I'll buy that, but I've not actually chosen to wrap my head and my heart around it and say, God, I am yours. Jesus, I want to follow you. God, I would pray even if there's somebody here in this service that is for the first time actually considering putting their faith, their belief that clings to this truth, Jesus, that you are the only way to God. I pray that that person would have that conversation with you, God, as that is between the two of you, and if they need prayer, they would find somebody on the sides like we always have. Maybe there's a moment for that today, and maybe for the rest of us, it's a consideration that as we leave this place, we don't leave it, we take it with us, so that this week in all that we do, we would ask the question, God, is my faith showing up here? God, is my faith showing up here? Help us put feet to our faith. It's in your name we pray, God. Amen.